exports ranks only behind those of Russia and Saudi Arabia. The analysis from the Australia Institute says Australia is the third largest coal, oil and gas exporter in the world and fifth largest miner of fossil fuels. The report says Australia has an opportunity and an obligation to decarbonise its exports in line with the Paris Agreement. And Richie Merzian is the Climate and Energy Program Director at the Australia Institute, and he joins us now from Canberra. Richie Merzian, good morning. So tell us about how you approached this study.
So we set up countries side by side and looked at what they actually exported, converted that into emissions, and we were surprised to find that Australia has a podium place. It ranks third in terms of the carbon pollution that it ships overseas from its fossil fuels, only behind Russia and Saudi. So Australia plays an oversized role in terms of fueling the climate crisis through its coal and LNG exports.
And so why is it important to look at emissions from exports and not just emissions that are coming directly from individual countries?
Well, because this is a global problem and we need to see what Australia's role is, both in terms of what it emits here, but also in how it's supplying the fossil fuels that are used overseas. So Australia exports twice as much carbon pollution as it's responsible for domestically. And it really helps debunk this concept that Australia only has a small role to play in fueling the climate crisis, when Australia is only 1.2% globally in terms of its domestic emissions, twice as much it sends overseas. So it helps paint the picture of how big Australia's role is.
Did you also look at domestic emissions or absolute emissions per head of population?
Yeah, so the report does look at the per capita emissions domestically, and it finds that Australia ranks in the top again in terms of per capita emissions just for what it's responsible for here. It's like there are 40 countries that have larger populations that emit less greenhouse gases domestically than Australia. So Australia has a massive role domestically in terms of what it emits on our shores, but then an even bigger role in terms of how it fuels that pollution overseas, bigger than even the US.
At the Pacific Islands Forum meeting last week in Tuvalu, the federal government was keen to point out the continuing contribution of China to global emissions. What is happening with China, and to what extent can the government point to China and say, look what's happening there, the focus should be on places like China?
Well, Australia exports more fossil fuel emissions than China. Australia is the largest exporter of coal in the world, and a good chunk of that goes to China. So Australia has a role to play in actually supplying these fossil fuels that China and many others are responsible for burning. So whilst China is doing what it can to keep the lights on and electrify its country, including through fossil fuels, Australia has a role to play in fueling that and helping to make that transition away from coal and towards other sources of less polluting energy. And so Australia has a role to play both in China's transition and in terms of what Australia can do onshore.
But what do you make of the government's argument that China is allowed to continue increasing emissions until 2030?
Well, I mean, China is also developing, whereas Australia is a developed country. So we've already electrified, we've already sort of had a fair share of pollution. And China is actually on track to meet its Paris Agreement target, whereas Australia is not. So I think it's a bit rich for us to argue that China should do more when Australia's not even doing what it said it would under the Paris Agreement.
But the government is insistent that it is in line to meet those Paris commitments. What have you found about Australia's ability to do that?
Well, Australia lacks any credible climate and energy policy, and the Australian government's own projections show that it'll miss its 2030 target under the Paris Agreement. And that's including the fact that Australia is trying to use a loophole that would allow it to use these dodgy carbon credits that it accrued from the past climate agreement to actually reduce its effort to meet its Paris Agreement target. Many of these were raised by Pacific leaders last week in their attempts to try and address climate change and trying to get their largest neighbour and largest polluter to actually do its fair share. So the Australian government really needs to look at what it can do before it can call on others to do more.
Okay, Richie Merzian, thanks for joining us this morning from Canberra.
My pleasure.
Tonight's episode of Four Corners on ABC TV examines Australia's apartment